Hello there, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views report on the politics of Africa and Arabia. On the International Education Day, the United Nations were warning of an intensification of the education crisis in East and Southern Africa. A joint statement by the children's charity UNICEF and the educational organization UNESCO stated that 41 million of the approximately 165 million school-age children in these areas did not receive an adequate school education. The region includes crisis countries such as South Sudan and Somalia, but also South Africa and Namibia. In addition to the lack of teachers, the United Nations primarily criticizes the tight budgets of governments for education. Somalia, for example, only spends 0.3% of its gross domestic product on education. The states in the region also missed out on sustainable development of the education sector as a result of the first World Education Forum in Dakar 23 years ago. At that time, the world community agreed on the goal of giving all children worldwide access to basic education by 2015. In East and South Africa, only a provisional educational infrastructure was set up and poorly trained teachers were hired with uncertain contract conditions. These interim solutions are still largely standard today. The United Nations therefore called on the countries in the region to allocate a fifth of their national budgets to education expenditure in the future. International Education Day is celebrated annually on January 24th. Since December 2018, the UN has wanted to honor the role of education in global peace with this day of remembrance. According to the United Nations, Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest literacy levels in the world. Only a tenth of 10-year-olds can read and understand a simple text. Two Lebanese MPs staged a sit-in in front of parliament to protest the lack of agreement on appointing a new president after Michel Aoun's terms expired on October 31st. According to local media, MP Melem Jalaf also took part in the sit-in. The two spent Thursday night in Parliament and have not yet announced whether they will remain there indefinitely until a president is elected. Jalaf himself stressed on Wednesday that the election of a president who can save Lebanon is urgent and announced that he would present an initiative to keep Parliament in permanent session until this goal is achieved. The protests have been sparked after Parliament failed for the 11th time on Thursday to elect a successor to Aoun, while the government was also still in office after resigning, leaving the country in near total political paralysis. In Thursday's vote, there were 34 votes for reformist MP Michel Mouawad, 37 blank ballots and 14 for the text New Lebanon. MPs from the Shia militia party Hezbollah and its Shia ally Amal walked out after the first round of voting, in which they voted no, causing a quorum to be lost. The severe economic and financial crisis in Lebanon continues to worsen as well. The national currency fell to a record low of 50,000 Lebanese pounds to the US dollar on Thursday. At the beginning of the crisis in 2019, the same sum was still worth around 33 US dollars. Since then, the pound has lost about 95% of its value. Lebanon has been stuck in a political vacuum for months. The country's political leadership cannot agree on a new president, as I said in the last part of the video. The population of the small Mediterranean country is struggling with the consequences. Many families have slipped into poverty. According to the United Nations, about 3/4 of the population are affected by poverty. Because the country is running out of foreign exchange and banks are only allowing limited withdrawals, many Lebanese can no longer access their savings in US dollars. Retailers and supermarkets have since adjusted their prices in light of the currency's newest low. In a parliamentary vote on Thursday, as I said, no candidate for the presidency received the required majority for the 11th attempt. The previous president, Michel Aoun, left office as planned at the end of October. The government of Prime Minister Najib Mikati is only in office in an executive capacity and is therefore only able to act to a limited extent. UN peacekeepers have found mass graves containing at least 49 civilian bodies in northeastern DRC. That was announced by the United Nations. Deputy UN spokesman Farhan Haq said the bodies were found in two villages in Ituri province, about 30 kilometers east of the provincial capital Bunia. A total of 42 victims, including 6 children, were found in a mass grave in Nyamamba village and the bodies of 7 other men in Mbogi village. Over the weekend, there had been a series of attacks blamed on local militias. According to local authorities, the militiamen also abducted several women. The soldiers reportedly discovered the graves during a patrol after attacks by suspected Codeco militias that were reported there. Haag called for an investigation to see if there was a link between the attacks and the mass graves. The UN mission MONUSCO supports the Congolese judicial system in investigating the attacks and demands that the perpetrators be held accountable. In Ituri, on the border with Uganda, there have been repeated attacks by the Codeco militia in recent weeks. The militia is considered an armed political religious sect which claims to defend the interests of the Lendu ethnic group. It is considered the most violent group in the region and is held responsible for numerous attacks. In June, 7 Codeco factions announced an end to violence against civilians in Ituri. However, they have gradually resumed their attacks. At least 195 people have died in attacks blamed on Codeco militias and other armed groups since December. More than 1.5 million people in Ituri province have been displaced by the fighting. Mali has received a shipment of Russian warplanes and transport helicopters, the latest from the West African state's new and key military and political ally. The head of the Malian military junta, Colonel Assimi Goïta, received the 8 Su-25 fighter jets and 2 Mi-8 transport helicopters. Mali has been relying on Russian Wagner mercenaries for around a year as well. The deployment of the German Bundeswehr there is becoming more and more dangerous. It will only remain if the parliamentary elections, which have been postponed several times and are now scheduled for February 2024, take place. UN Human Rights Commissioner Türk has condemned the assassination of a leading opposition figure in the Kingdom of Eswatini, that's between Mozambique and South Africa. Authorities in Africa's last absolute monarchy must launch a quick and independent investigation, he said. Türk described the killed human rights lawyer Thulani Maseko as an advocate of peace and democracy. He spoke for the voiceless. He was shot dead in his home over the weekend. The ruling king, Mswati III, recently ruled more and more authoritarian. After independence from Britain in 1968, his father abolished the multi-party system. Pro-democracy protests and violence against critics have been repeated in Eswatini for 2 years. More than 6,000 large wild animals have fallen victim to the ongoing drought in Kenya's Amboseli National Park alone over the past 6 months. The International Fund for Animal Welfare said on Tuesday that more animals have died in a drought there since records began 4 decades ago. The short rains are not enough for wildlife vital vegetation to recover, said Robert Kless, director of IFAW Germany. The balance sheet in the national park at the foot of the Kilimanjaro, which is popular with tourists, is therefore devastating. Between June and November, around 130 elephants, 3,900 wild beasts and 1,400 zebras died as a result of the drought. More than 90 of the threatened Maasai giraffes would not have survived the dry period either. The Kenyan Wildlife Research and Training Institute reported last year that 205 elephants died in Kenya between February and October as a result of the drought. In addition to the Amboseli National Park, the neighboring Tsavo and Laikipia Samburu Park north of Mount Kenya were affected in 22. Almost 50 grey zebras died in Samburu despite a feeding program. The species is threatened with extinction, and larger stocks only live in Kenya. A suicide bomber rammed a car loaded with explosives into the gate of a government building in the Somali capital Mogadishu on Sunday. Armed fighters from the Islamist terrorist militia Al-Shabaab then stormed the seat of the regional government, which houses, among other things, the office of the mayor of Mogadishu and the governor of the surrounding Benadir region. That's what police officer Mohammed Dahir told the German press agency. According to Dahir, the terrorists fired a round and at least 6 people were killed, including 2 security forces, 3 civilians and the suicide bomber. The mayor and numerous other officials were evacuated by security forces, Dahir said. However, the suspected terrorists continued to besiege the building until Sunday evening. The attack was only ended after 6 hours. All 6 attackers from the Islamist terrorist militia Al-Shabaab were killed. The information ministry said that on Sunday evening. The crisis state on the Horn of Africa, with around 16 million inhabitants, has been rocked by terrorist attacks and other acts of violence for years, especially by Al-Shabaab. The government has been waging a military offensive against Al-Shabaab for several months. The government was able to conquer large parts of central Somalia. At the same time, the extremists are increasing the frequency of their attacks. Gabon's Foreign Minister Michael Musa Adamo died on Friday after suffering a heart attack at a cabinet meeting. Specialists tried unsuccessfully to revive him. That's what the government of the Central African country said. A source close to the presidential palace told the AFP news agency that Musa Adamo sat down and felt uncomfortable at the start of the cabinet meeting. The 62-year-old was taken unconscious to a military hospital where he died in the afternoon. President Ali Bongo Ondimba described Musa Adamo on Twitter as a great diplomat and true statesman. He also spoke of a great loss for Gabon. And this concludes this week's report on African and Arabian politics. I'll see you tomorrow in my next video. I'll be back.